And we're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our virtual presentation of The Comfort of Monsters with author Willa C. Richards and our moderator, Chia-Chia Lin. We have signed copies of The Comfort of Monsters available since Willa came to our store to sign them in person. So to purchase one, just click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer's screen. It'll take you to our website where you can complete your purchase. Just make sure to write a signed copy in the order comments so that we know that you would like a signed copy specifically. And this event includes an audience Q&A. So to submit your question, just use the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. You can also vote for any questions you'd like, and they'll make their way to the very top of the list. And also, if you don't know how to use that function, feel free to use the chat. I'll move it to the Ask a Question box so that we have everything compiled in one place. All right, so with that said, let me introduce our guests, and then we can jump right into the conversation. So Willa C. Richards is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she was a Truman Capote Fellow. She earned her PhD in English from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and her work has appeared in the Paris Review, and she is a recipient of the PEN Prize for Emerging Writers. And joining her tonight is Chia-Chia Lin, who is the author of The Unpassing, which won the 2020 Clark Fiction Prize and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize. All right, so with that said, I'm going to turn off my camera and hand things over to our guests. Enjoy the talk, everyone.
Thanks, Jura. I just want to say first that I am so excited to have the chance to talk about this beautiful, gut-wrenching book with Willa. We went to school together many years ago. I mean, actually, physically pains me to count the years, but
yeah,
it's been 8 years since we met.
No.
And yeah, it has. And I read I think one, maybe two drafts of this book. I was trying to remember, but it kind of blurs in my mind in the intervening years. So it just kind of feels to me like this book just sprang into being, this like gorgeous book just became finished. Because you wrote most of it, I think, after we left school. And I'm sure that it doesn't feel that way to you, but but I love this book. And I guess, one of the things that I'm most interested in is the research that went into this book. I've read literally thousands of pages, I think, of your writing, both published and unpublished. And one of the many, many things that I've always loved about your writing is the settings. And specifically the mood of the settings you write, the richness of the settings, and the level of research that basically goes into every world that you create. And, not everyone is so conscientious about getting the world right. And even if you are, it doesn't mean that you have an eye for which details to include, So I would love to hear just about the process of doing research for this book.
Yeah, definitely. We'll get into it. And I just want to say first, thank you so much for doing this. And thank you to Vroman for having us. It feels really, really special to be here with you, sort of coming full circle. So thank you so much. And it is funny to hear you say that the book sprang into being because it was probably 5 or 6 years, I think. I started it when we were at Iowa, but the very last semester. And then the bulk of it I wrote after we left. And it feels like the entire time since we left, I've been working on it. So it was a long process. But yeah, I think you've read a couple of drafts. And I think, the research is one thing that I definitely layered in throughout the drafts. And I feel like I remember you said with one of them, that you were like really eager for more of it. I remember that comment after maybe the first one you read, and especially as Milwaukee goes, the sort of Milwaukee specific details. So I think a lot of the research process was about layering, especially as the drafting goes. But the initial stuff was pretty heavy. I think I started right away, sort of as soon as I decided that I wanted to set the book during the summer that the Dahmer crimes were discovered, I, really committed myself to the research about the crimes, like just basic facts. Because I didn't really know anything beyond sort of the pop culture narratives of the crimes. So that was really important to me to just get like the basic facts. And then from there, I just sort of tried to focus on reading a lot of like the reporting and reading like a diversity of reporting. So different communities, whether it was the mainstream reporting, which was the Milwaukee Journal, was sort of the forefront of reporting on the Dahmer crimes that summer in Milwaukee. A lot of the national news actually used the Milwaukee Journal's reporting. And then the gay community was reporting on it as well. It didn't get as much coverage, but the Wisconsin Light was the leading gay newspaper at the time. So I tried to focus a lot on like what people were saying about the crimes specifically, and less on sort of the gory details of them. And that's sort of how I kept myself centered and focused as I was moving through all the material, because there's so much out there about the crimes.
Yeah, totally. I mean, one of my questions was kind of how you avoid falling into, that deep research pit from which I feel like many people never come out, because there's just something like this. It's just so noisy, There's just
very
so
noisy.
All of it is so there's so many details to sift through. A lot of it is very sensational. It's just really interesting to me how you sift through it and decide what to include and what you don't include, which is probably the bulk, of what you do.
Yeah. I mean, I think that definitely was one of the hardest things. I mean, I think having a really focused lens at the beginning of it was the most important part. But even with that really focused lens of saying like, okay, I'm going to be looking specifically at, what are people saying when they're talking about these crimes, looking at the reporting, looking at, whether it was like what specific sort of like police chiefs were saying, detectives, like all of these sort of oral, histories. Even with that lens, it was like I filled up, hundreds of pages of Word documents of details that didn't end up it, because this other thing is like it's all interesting, right? Yeah. So I think again, I had a very specific interest in just like the discourse, like what people were talking about, and then that sort of helped me from getting too bogged down into especially into the specificity of Dahmer's childhood, or I didn't look at anything related to his interviews, or I know he had a couple of things, but I tried not to focus as much on any of that narrative, and more just what were the community reactions, and what were people talking about.
Well, I think that's why this book is so fascinating to me from this perspective, because everyone has heard of Jeffrey Dahmer, but I just felt like I didn't know anything at all. I didn't know any of the facts. And I think it's because, all the noise was focused on Jeffrey Dahmer, and you kind of carve space around it for more people's sort of versions of the story, and for more people's stories as well. And I really, really appreciate that. I felt like I learned so much. But, every detail that you included was just so interesting. There was an ad in a magazine at some point in the book where it was I think the Milwaukee Police Department was selling copies of Dahmer's confession. Is that real?
Yeah, that's real. I mean, there was a huge black market that sprung up around everything related to him, and even his personal belongings that, they were originally going to auction off. Actually, I think they did auction him off. But it was a really, and then Jeffrey Dahmer trading cards and all of these things, there was a huge black market for all of anything really related to him, which is crazy. I got a lot of those details from a really important book by Richard Tithicott, and he sort of looks at the construction of him as a our societal construction of him as a serial killer, and a lot of it was those sorts of things, creating trading cards for this person, right? And so that was a really important resource because he had a lot of those details that I was like, what? people did what?
Okay. I mean, there's research with respect to Dahmer, but I'm also like interested in the actual, like the world around it, like Milwaukee in the 1990s, early 1990s. And I assume that you had to do research around this too, because I know you're from Milwaukee, you're from Wisconsin, but you probably don't remember, this decade from growing up. And so, did you also like have to talk to family members, or where did you get kind of like the richness of the setting details?
Yeah, definitely a lot of conversations with family. I had a lot of people talk to me about the smell of the city, especially at that particular time, that particular summer. And like the yeast and the breweries were like every day it was just like the air was super yeasty downtown. So like those really specific details, a lot of them came from my family. Also the chocolate factory that Dahmer worked at, where they eventually closed down, but they had sold all of the beans, like the leftover beans, and the city bought them and used them as like mulch. And I think my mom told me that, so there is a lot that came. Yeah, there was a lot that came from my family, and that stuff was all really important. And then a lot of it was sort of mixed in with like memories of being little and being like downtown in Milwaukee in the 90s. And then, the other part was definitely reading, again, just the reporting from that time, I think was really helpful to get a sense of like beyond just like the Dahmer stuff, but like what were the concerns in the city at the time, right? Like, I think the other thing going into it that I didn't necessarily realize was the city, as was the nation and the world's coming off of a massive AIDS crisis. And so this was something that really was looming over the city as well. And there was a lot of, confrontation and protests around police in multiple communities in Milwaukee. So a lot of that stuff definitely came also from reading old newspapers and doing that kind of research.
Okay. More generally, you write a lot of fiction, not just this book, but your stories that are set in the Midwest. And, often we think of farms, but here we get an urban setting of Milwaukee. And, Midwest fiction isn't rare exactly, but it's certainly not as common as like coastal fiction, And I can't remember another book that I've set that's actually set in Milwaukee specifically. And so I'm curious, like, what do you think about when you write about the Midwest? I know maybe it's like the only sort of setting that you know well, but I know you've lived in other places as well. But do you feel like pressure to represent it a certain way?
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely feel a responsibility. I mean, I feel lucky that I get to write about it. I definitely growing up didn't read a lot of things set in Milwaukee, set in Wisconsin. And I definitely didn't see a lot of it portrayed on TV or, in movies. So I think it's very joyful for me to like write about the Midwest and to write about like things that I think coastal people don't always like realize, a lot of the extraordinary beauty of the Midwest, especially like with the Great Lakes. But I think, this book was hard in the sense that I've gotten the question to like, oh, you say you love Milwaukee, but then you also chose to, portray it at this very, very fraught, painful time for the city. And, I think that was hard too, because it was really like the first, well, it's obviously my first book, but it was the first big project I set in Milwaukee. So, I think I tried to combat that a little bit by just like speaking to Milwaukeeans about really specific place details and like calling out, things that people that lived in that area would, just know like that. So I felt that responsibility in a certain sense, because it's always really like validating when you get to read about your hometown, even if it's not, always in the cheeriest of settings, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there are other details too. I mean, not just centered around, what was happening in Milwaukee in 1991, but there are other details that just feel very Midwestern to me too. Like, for example, this story is about a girl whose sister goes missing. And right after she goes missing, the family is undergoing this great tragedy. And, I know that there's a lot of sort of grief in this, but it's also just so like warm to me as well. They create this command center, and they paste like a map on the wall, and they put dots where this girl might have been. Her name is Dee, and then they start making pies. And it just feels like, oh, this is a very Midwestern response. They make like a million pies, like meat pies and fruit pies, like meat pies especially. And then they just end up eating pies for like weeks as they like go through this unfolding tragedy. And it's just stuff like that. It just feels, I don't know, it just feels really authentic to me, having only lived for 2 years, but and nobody ever made me a pie the whole time. But
oh no, I'm sorry. I should have made you one. Although I don't think I'd like gotten my crust skills at that point. They've developed since because it runs in my family. That's definitely like a straight familial detail. Although I have to say that I think at one point, I don't remember if it was like my agent or one of my editors was like, should they stop eating so much pie? Like at some point, should we maybe, this is like a lot of pie references. And I was like, oh yeah, it's true.
I mean, there's something about it that just feels like, you gather yourselves together as a family and you make pies and then you eat them. But anyways, I appreciate that.
I love it.
So more about the actual story in this book. This young woman, Dee, disappears, and the story is narrated by her sister, Peg. But it's also a bigger story than that. We've got the Dahmer murders sort of occurring at the same time, and it's a story about other victims and other crimes as well. And I'm wondering, like, how do you think about the plot of this book? Like, did you set out to sort of, overlap these different like stories, or did it just sort of happen naturally?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely set out to overlap them, and I think I was really interested in like, especially in our, our media sphere as it exists now. But I think even back in the 90s, it was true too that, there's like only so much space for like one narrative in one sort of segment of TV, right? And it's like, it feels like, things are happening all the time, especially when it comes to like crimes. But when it comes to like the narrative that gets boiled down, there's not room. There's just like, even though there's 24-hour news cycle, but it feels like it's hard for things to like fit into the same space when it comes to a story as far as like news goes. So I was sort of interested in like, juxtaposing those crimes and thinking a lot about like, different like smaller crimes that would be sort of like subsumed by larger ones and what that would look like. And then especially as relates to the, media influence and interference in like sort of both criminal investigations and then coverage, and how much influence, what kinds of media coverage and resources, like what influence that has on how cases are investigated and prosecuted and all of that. And so it felt like the juxtaposition of those things was pretty natural. Like once I decided to do it, then the plot did just sort of like roll out for me from there. And I felt like they really sort of spoke to one another in interesting ways as I was drafting.
Okay. And, the main story, like what we would call like story A, is a missing person story. And then, there's like story B and story C. But in this missing person story, I feel like, there's usually just two outcomes when you have a story like that. Either you find out what happens to the missing person, or you don't. And I'm wondering if you struggled with that as a confine, or if you, I guess I'm just curious to hear about working with that kind of structure.
Yeah, I think it was really difficult. It was hard, especially because I had a sense of like, even starting the short story, I had a very clear sense of what I wanted the ending of that short story to be. And in my mind, that was always going to be the ending of the book. That didn't end up happening. But, I think that in the back of my mind the whole time while I was drafting definitely made me feel like a little bit in a straitjacket when I was working with the plot, especially like as I got closer to the end. So I think it was difficult, but I also think it sort of forced me to be more creative with like the thematic stuff I was interested in exploring, and like leaning on, these issues of memory and of grief, and sort of like living with like unknowing, and all of those sorts of things. I felt like that it gave me a little bit, or it sort of forced me to put a little bit more pressure on those things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And I think like another way that, this book kind of leaves those confines a little bit is with the narrator, Peg. She's not totally reliable, and there's something about the way she tells a story that is sort of atypical of sort of, I think, a crime story. And actually, I was hoping that you could read just like a very short excerpt for us. It starts on page 185. And I think, I think it's just always nice to hear the writer read a little bit, just in a minute, in your voice.
Okay.
It starts with the memories I've curated, and then ends with a bad job.
Bad job. Okay. The memories I curated so carefully for the previous 30 years became inexplicably, irredeemably strange to me. I'd spent the decade since we'd lost Dee taking care of my memories the way other people take care of their families, their homes, their bodies. I had sunk all of my energy into remembering the months before Dee went missing. And for the first time since she disappeared, I began to wonder if I had done a bad job.
Yeah, and actually, there's like two more sentences. I'll just read it, so I'm not to.
Okay.
And then it continues. Certainty is like a drug, a great comfort. When it's lost, the effect is that of withdrawal, fever, nausea, sweating, headaches, intense, unending pain, and above all else, an ocean's worth of desire to regain that which will make the pain stop. And I just love these bits because, they get at how Peg, on one hand, her life has totally stagnated after the disappearance of her sister, and nothing is changing. And it's really tragic, like how one track her life is after that. She's like just always poring over the missing persons report in the files. At the same time, there is this weird kind of like shifting change. Her memories are not staying still. And she becomes destabilized as the book goes on by like what she remembers, She literally has no memory of an interview that happened. She misremembers like the significance of a necklace. And I'd love to hear more about writing this point of view, and one that like, the reader can't entirely trust.
Yeah. I mean, it was like, I hesitate to say it this way, but it was a lot of fun to write, to write from her point of view, especially, as relates to the memories, I guess. And I think it was something that emerged through subsequent drafts. I worked on sort of the arc of what would happen with her knowing, and like believing, and her certainty in what she believed had happened specifically. And in earlier drafts, sort of the idea was she never was destabilized. She always sort of knew what happened, trusted herself. She felt like she knew Dee the best, so she was the one that definitely had the answers. And I think as I started working through that, and especially as I juxtaposed like her memories with what this psychic that the family hires to try to find Dee, what he says happens, when I sort of layered those against one another, I think it helped me to sort of think about how she could be destabilized, and also how, like, of course she wouldn't remember everything. And of course there would be things that crucial things that would have disappeared, because you can't control that type of stuff. You can't really control what you remember and what you don't. So I think it was definitely something that sort of emerged in the later drafts. And then once I sort of was working with that arc, I felt like it was a way to sort of provide her with a little bit of redemption. Like, I know that passage doesn't seem like it, but I think it was a way for her also to begin the process of sort of forgiving herself, because it was like, well, I don't know everything that happened, and it's not all on me, right? Where I think she spends a lot of her life thinking like it's very much her fault in a certain way.
Yeah. I am going to wrap up so that we can take some questions, but just really quick, with your writing process, I just want to ask you like 2 quick questions about your writing process. It's always kind of fun for me. Was there ever a point at which you got stuck? And I'm sure I know the answer to this. I think all writers of novels, which are very long, have like a terrible crisis, at some point along the way. But I'd like to hear about your particular crisis and how you worked your way out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I had many, but I had 2 major crises, and one number sticks in my head, and it's 170. Because that is like the page number that I like hit this huge snag on, and I would open the draft and it would be like, I don't even know. I think it ended up being months before I like moved on from that page number, but I would just look at it and be like, oh my God, I'm still at 170. And part of that was because I had ended, like I wrote the book in 2 different timelines. Like I wrote the 1991 section first, and I wrote all of it chronologically. And then I wrote the 2019 section, and I wrote all of that chronologically. So they existed as like a part 1 and part 2. And 170 was like right around where the 91 section was ending. And it was really scary to start the 2019 stuff. So I think that was really hard to like, I felt like I didn't want to end the 91 because I was scared to start the 2019 sections, if that makes sense. So I stayed on that for a while. And I think one of the ways ended up being in a graduate workshop at UWM. And I think I forced myself to submit something from the 2019 section to that workshop. And I think that really helped sort of like get the juices flowing. And then I was able to sort of dig into that. And then the other crisis was sort of related to the character of the psychic and sort of figuring out what his role would be, and also what Peg's relationship to his character would be. And that took a long time to sort of like strike the right balance. Yeah, so those were the 2 big ones, but there were many small crises along the way, as I'm sure you know.
Daily crises.
Yeah.
And then my last question is for you. I just feel like everyone has sort of a different story about how they arrived at the title. And I know when I read a draft of this, it was a totally different title. It was called The Torturer's Horse. And now it is The Comfort of Monsters.
The Comfort of Monsters.
So yeah, just curious, how you came to it and why you stayed with it and what it means to you.
Yeah, I mean, I had that title for a really long time, and I think there was a total of 1 person that liked it, like in my whole life. So that should have been my first clue. But that was from a W.H. Auden poem, and I was very into it, but no one else was. And so I think I was playing around with different titles, and I remember I was reading an essay that was sort of about actually Silence of the Lambs and like serial killers in general. Jeffrey Dahmer was in there a little bit, but there was this phrase, and I remember writing it down in my little, Google Doc, and it just like felt so perfect. And I played around with it for a little while, and in the opposite of The Torturer's Horse, like everyone was like, yes, that's the one. So everyone was really excited about it. I do remember that. But yeah, I think for me, it sort of spoke to, this idea that like, whether it's the serial killer or like the individual monster within, a society, it's like, okay, there's this person or this thing that we can take comfort because like that's the issue, rather than sort of like looking at our own roles or looking at the larger sort of societal or like institutional structures, because that's a lot harder, right? Those problems are just much more intractable and more difficult to really tackle. So I think that that really resonated to me with a lot of the thematic things in the story of sort of like, you know, whether it's Dee's boyfriend as being like the monster or Jeffrey Dahmer is the monster of like, okay, well, that person is the problem, but we don't have to deal with any of this sort of underlying societal issues, I guess, that created this quote unquote monster. So that was very long-winded.
I love the title. And I think it's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely, the first time I saw it written out, I was also like, okay, yeah, that's it. That's the one.
I am going to look at the questions. So it says, I asked you earlier about Wisconsin, and specifically Milwaukee literature. Who are the touchstones of that literature? And have any of them been particularly important to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think like Midwest literature, I would say definitely Marilynne Robinson. That, you know, I think her writing in particular has been super important to me. You know, I would also say like I haven't read a ton of David Foster Wallace, but my brother was super into him, and so I did try, and I was like, okay, you know, here's a Midwestern author that's doing really cool things. But yeah, I would definitely say Marilynne Robinson, also Louise Erdrich. She was really important to me. I loved her books before, you know, when I was like growing up, and then I sort of rediscovered them again, especially Love Medicine at the workshop. And I think, yeah, especially like as she writes a lot about Midwestern winters, and that's very evocative for me. So yeah, I think those are like the big ones.
Here's a related question. What are you currently reading?
I am currently reading How Much of These Hills Are Made of Gold. I don't know if I got that title right. And I love it. I'm wondering if I should move it from not reading it before bed because it, you know, and I know I'm like, my book is super, super dark, but it's very dark. But it is so beautifully written. And also it has a very, very interesting sibling relationship. So I wrote a little sibling list book, and I didn't put it on there because where I'm at right now, neither of the siblings have died. But it, and that one was
Still
about
like,
it could still happen, exactly. But it's so beautifully written, and I'm really, really loving it.
And that's by C. Pam Zhang, right?
Yes, thank you.
And let's see. Here's something that I wondered about too. Your book spans the decades from 1991 to 2019, and you know there are these sort of two timelines, but it does also like cover the decades in between and memories and so on. Did you face any challenges with pacing?
Yeah, a ton of challenges. It was really difficult. I think, you know, especially because, like I said, I wrote all of the 91 stuff first, and then I wrote the 2019. And when they were existing as like part one and part two, I felt like the 91 stuff was like so loaded with momentum, and the pacing was very natural and felt very easy. And the 2019 stuff was like a little quieter. There was less happening. And that felt really challenging to sort of get the gears moving in the 2019 stuff. And I remember my agent was like, I think you could try to weave them together. And it was like a really inspired editorial suggestion that I was a little bummed out by at first because it was like a lot of work. But it did a ton for the pacing on both ends. And I think once I started weaving them together, those challenges really fell away much faster. So that was exciting.
Here is a question about research. Did you have to do research on the families of missing victims in cold cases to develop Peg's character?
Yeah, I definitely did. I mean, I think that's one reason that and a lot of it was from reporting. So I'll say that. Again, I think that was one of my biggest resources in general was especially local newspapers. But, I think was one reason that I wanted to write this book in general is because like there are so many of these families, and it's a really crushing existence. And it's also one that I feel like sort of isn't often portrayed. Like you mentioned earlier, it's either like, okay, you find someone or you get the mystery solved or wrapped up. And I was really interested in portraying, these existences where you have to live for so long without knowing.
And what okay, what are your thoughts on how media chooses to report crime and the violence surrounding it?
This is like a dissertation question, I feel. I think I have a lot of thoughts on it. I think it's changed, and I think that it is there is more awareness surrounding these notions of victim blaming. But I will say that I feel like, especially as relates to like police brutality and police murder, there's a lot of victim blaming that goes on, because the media is so hungry for like why, and these narratives that are doing a lot of explaining on the part of the perpetrator of violence, and less on like the narrative of the victim. So I think that's the biggest thing, and that was one of the biggest things that I wanted to look at in the book is sort of like, why are we doing so much work to sort of like explain crimes rather than like, or to explain why someone did a crime, within their personal biography rather than looking at sort of like the larger institutional issues.
And this is the one I was reading when I was laughing earlier. You reviewed, and then in parentheses, very enthusiastically recently by the crime fiction columnist at the New York Times. Do you feel as if your book is in dialogue with that fiction?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that I think that readers of true crime narratives and crime fiction will definitely enjoy the book, especially because, as we talked about, I think there's a lot of details of the Dahmer crimes in particular that were sort of brushed under the rug or that a lot of people don't know about. So I do think that it's definitely in conversation. It's interesting because I did not set out to write like a crime book or to write a mystery necessarily. So I don't know what that says about me as a writer, but.
Well, here's a follow-up, not by the same person.
Okay.
My follow-up by choosing this question. What are some self-care tips you would like to give to writers who write about dark subjects?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, like I talked a lot about how long I worked on this book, and I think the biggest thing is just breaks, and then also, just having levity in your life, in other places. I like definitely went to a lot of just comedies. Like I was watching 30 Rock and Schitt's Creek and just, like really spending time with light stuff. And I think that's really helpful. Um, and yeah, I think a lot of breaks, especially when it comes to the research. For me, like the writing process, that's not always where I like feel the heaviness when I'm like drafting or writing, but it was in the research stuff. And I think, those materials can really like get in your head. So yeah, I think just making sure that you're focused with the research, you're not getting dragged down too many unnecessary rabbit holes, and that you take a lot of breaks.
Okay, and then last question, any projects that you're currently working on?
What'd you say?
I would also like to know.
Yeah, I'm working on something that I thought was going to be just a quick short story, but it's, like every single short story I've ever written, sort of spiraling out. But I haven't worked on it a lot lately. I've sort of been doing, stuff for the book and little essays and stuff like that. But yeah, I'm working on a longer project. I don't have very many specifics besides that, which I know isn't exciting to say, but
I'm just going to add that quick short story is not like really something I believe with you. Like, I don't think I've read maybe like 10 of your stories, and I don't think any of them has been under like 60 pages.
That's not true. That is not true. I've definitely I've gotten a little better. I wrote a story that was like 25 pages, if you can believe that. But yeah, I prefer the long form. Definitely. I'm not a short story writer by any means. It's usually the place where I like work out the ideas first, and then I'm like, okay.
So basically, it's your next novel.
I think short story writing is a totally different art of itself, and like you said, it's a great starting point for a novel. But thank you so much, Chia-Chia and Willa. That was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. And for those of you who are interested, we do have signed copies of The Comfort of Monsters available. Just click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer's screen. Yes, you can see the beautiful book cover right there. And for those of you who tuned in late, don't worry, a replay of this talk will be available once the broadcast ends. And where can our listeners, our viewers find you, just so that they can get connected?
So my website is willacrichards.com, and then I'm also on Instagram, that's what the kids are saying. I'm also on Instagram at Willa Cather, so that's CATHERR, 2 R's.
And how about you, Chia-Chia?
I pretty much use nothing. I do occasionally jump onto Instagram when I have like an event or something.
All right.
You have a website, though.
You do have a website.
Oh yeah, I do have a website. That's true. That I do not update. It's Chia-Chia Lin.
Okay.
All right. Well, that about does it. Stay safe, everyone, and have a good night. All right. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.